talking about language ideologies or language beliefs that tend to classify people in a given society into a hierarchy, a social and economic hierarchy. And I want to talk a little more depth about what these language ideologies are that are associated, for example, with English and our history. Two of the unexamined beliefs that are widely shared in our society have to do with what's called language standardization, and the other one has to do with monolingualism. Both of these are assumed to be superior, for example, to language diversity within a country and bilingualism within a country. There seems to be a fear, for example, to use Canada as an example, that the French separatists want to be separate and it's going to divide the country. In that case, that has not turned out to be the case, but there's a lot more linguistic diversity in the United States than is commonly assumed to be the case. And yet we have not divided ourselves into multiple countries over language. These two ideologies are very, very important for education. That's why I'm going into them in depth. They're often discussed separately because it's easier to put a label on them that way, but they function together and they merge together historically in the history of English. Nobody had an idea about the idea of a standard until the rise of European nation states in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. If we turn to English specifically, I want to give some examples of another country also. Printing arose in the 15th century, and printing, because suddenly this was written language is going to be widespread. Each printer from a different region in England would print according to his dialect. In other words, he would spell the word the way it sounded to him. So we did not have a standard spelling system at that time. What happened was that Caxton, one printer won out over the others in terms of his spelling system. So that's the one they used as the standard. And that's when spelling became standardized. It had not been standardized before then. Written English then became the model for the standard English. And that continues to be the case today. We all speak very differently nobody speaks like a book, for example. So our language can be standard grammatically, but perhaps it's a little more casual. It varies when we're at home versus when we're at school and so forth. But there is more of a sense of a standard with coming from the written English, published English. There's been little change over the centuries in that written standard, and that's why spelling sometimes is thought to be difficult in English. But many of those what look like abnormalities are really historically traceable to how they used to be pronounced. The GH, for example, from the Anglo-Saxon, the Germanic sound. Nevertheless, the spoken language in England, in the United States, in Australia, wherever English is spoken, in Africa, it continues to change. And there is still incredible variation. As you can tell, as you move around the United States, there's very different English in different regions of the United States. The same is true in England to this day. So the spoken English continues to evolve and change, and variation is simply natural. It's a fact of life. But the written English, because things are in print, has a little more staying power. So it's changed some, but not as much as the spoken. So as I was saying, the pressures for standardization did not really come about until about the 1700s. And this is at the same time, interestingly, that English was firmly established over French as the national language. Up until that time, French was used in courts and so forth because of the Normans conquering England in 1066. and French was the elite language. But by the 1700s, English became the dominant language. So Standard English, in sum, was not handed down by God to Moses on the mountaintop. It has a history. In fact, the idea of a Standard English was not even widespread until the Industrial Revolution in England. And the rising middle class, people wanted to be able to speak more like the upper class, so the idea of a standard came about. Usage manuals were written and so forth. And then we had this idea that we should be all speaking a Standard English. That became dominant. What was going on in 18th century Britain for this to happen? Well, 18th century in England saw a lot of advances in technology. I mentioned the Industrial Revolution, literacy, widespread literacy, printing, and so forth, communication, and there were big changes in education going on. And all of this together yielded a much more widespread consciousness of relatively uniform, quote-unquote, correct English than had been possible before. This is a quote from Milroy and Milroy's book. At the same time that we saw a rise in England of the idea of a correct English and a Standard English tied to the written language, the minority languages of the British Isles did not fare so well. So as English rose, Gaelic in Ireland and Scotland and Welsh in Wales was suppressed. Everyone was supposed to switch to English. This is the way in which the ideology of monolingualism is tied to language standardization in our history of English. One language, one nation became the ascendant idea in Europe in those centuries, 18th century, 19th century, and it still pervades much of the world today. That you find people in the United States passionately saying, we have to all speak English because we won't understand each other, but can't we also speak Spanish, French, German, whatever, Hindu? We can speak all these other languages, Hindi, sorry, and along with English. It doesn't have to be. You can be a multilingual nation and have a common language to communicate in. Let's turn now to 18th century France as another example of standard language. And this is very powerful in France. France is very, very insistent to this day, and the French education system is extremely insistent that everyone speak the correct French. The French Revolution, in fact, in the late 18th century, promoted the idea that language makes the nation. Before the Revolution, the Ancien Régime promoted dialects and local languages, of which there are many in France, referred to usually together as patois. And partly because the monarchy wanted to divide and conquer, I suppose, and the church wanted to convert people, so they wanted to speak to them in their own language. So the revolutionaries took the opposite tack. No, we all have to speak standard French because this will liberate everybody from oppression. Only standard French was said to be able to express the ideals of the revolution. Regional dialects and languages, as I said, referred to as patois, were not adequate for this, according to the revolutionaries. And even though prior to the revolution, regional dialects and languages had been promoted, the anti-clericalism of the revolution contributed to reinforcing this policy of francisation, or enforcing the use of the national language. One of the ideals of the revolution in France also was universal education, mass literacy, and so revolutionary language policy became educational policy as well. It's another example of how revolutionary changes are often carried out, and language policy is often carried out through education. The patois were viewed as, quote, according to Schiffman, barriers to communication, obstacles to the spread of the ideas of the revolution, which, once made available to every citizen, would enlighten and liberate them.